This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and the history of imperialism, the history of the role of the United States is critical to understanding not only what is happening internationally, but what is now taking place in the United States with the decline of the U.S. Empire. And joining us is Chris Hedges, who is a journalist, writer, and has actually been covering the role of the United States internationally for decades, and has also a show which is on RTV, but is not available to people in the United States and not on the major cable systems. And he basically has been censored out of the mainstream media in the United States. But we are going to talk with him about his history, his analysis, and the issues facing the American working people. So welcome to our program, Chris.
Thank you. It is available, Steve, in some states. It was removed in California, it was removed in New York State because it had, I think, large viewership for the whole network, and it can be watched on YouTube. Also on portable TV, not that I know how to work that.
Okay, well, I'm glad it is available, and I know it's available on the internet if you look for it. But as far as mainstream cable systems, I know on Comcast.
Yes, that's true. It's also broadcast by KPFK and WBAI.
And we should work to get it on KPFK.
Yes,
in
definitely.
That would be
for
very
sure. It doesn't cost you anything. Just take it.
Exactly. Well, thanks. I will push for that. So thanks for
Right.
that suggestion. So, Chris, why don't we start by how you came to become a journalist and covering issues, and then your work at the New York Times.
Well, I was in divinity school at Harvard and living in Roxbury, a depressed neighborhood in Boston, running a small church. My father was a minister. My mother was a seminary graduate, although she went on to become a professor. So I grew up in the church, very close to the Catholic worker movement. Dan and Phil Berrigan were kind of heroes in our house. And so I was going to be an inner city minister. And although I'd always written, I'd published my first story in the Christian Science Monitor when I was a senior in college and editor of my high school paper, all that kind of stuff. But I became increasingly disenchanted with liberals. People, I would commute in from the projects at Cambridge, where people liked the poor, but they didn't like the smell of the poor, talking about empowering people they never met. And became very close to a guy named Robert Cox, who was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. While I was there, he had been the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald during the Dirty War, the only newspaper on the front page to publish the names of the desaparecidos from the night before, until they came and took him away. And he only survived because he's a British citizen. The British government intervened to get him out of the country. And I really saw in Bob's work what a social conscience married to journalism could do. So I left school. I studied Spanish with the Maryknoll, the Catholic Missionary Society in Bolivia, in Cochabamba at the Instituto de Idiomas. Then I freelanced in South America for the Washington Post. I covered the Falkland War for National Public Radio from Buenos Aires. And at that point decided that I would remain in Latin America and be a journalist. I did go back and finish my degree under heavy pressure from my parents. But as soon as I graduated, I went to El Salvador as a freelancer to cover the war. I was there for 5 years. I was eventually hired by the Dallas Morning News. And so that was how I entered journalism, with a very clear decision to use journalism to amplify the voices of people who were, in the case of El Salvador, under a murderous assault backed by the Reagan administration. But those voices that wouldn't be heard normally within a society, those voices that are routinely shut out, those voices that are being crushed by systems of power. And that remains today for me what real journalism is about. That doesn't mean I ever lied. I wasn't a propagandist for the FMLN or the Sandinistas or the Palestinians or the Kurds. I spent 20 years overseas, but I always put myself in places where people were living under extreme duress, whether that was Gaza. I was in Sarajevo during the war in the former Yugoslavia. So that was my, how I ended up in journalism.
Well, you're shaping your role in getting these stories out what did you, I mean, you talked about the role of the United States, for example, in El Salvador, but of course, El Salvador is not unique. The role of the United States on a global level is quite extensive. And uh, why don't you talk about the different experiences you had in covering these stories? Because it seems like every country you went to, the United States was centrally involved in shaping what was going on and also protecting the oligarchy and those people in charge of the country.
Right, that might be a little less true for Yugoslavia. It was a little more complicated there. But certainly that was true in the Middle East, and it was true in Latin America. Um, so I consciously put myself in places where people were, essentially being dominated and oppressed and often killed by either proxies of the United States or sometimes by the United States itself. So that was a conscious decision. When I was hired by the Dallas Morning News, I worked in Central America after 5 years of covering the war, and particularly in El Salvador. It's a long time to be in a war zone. I had a nervous tick in my face. I suffered from pretty severe PTSD. I had to get out. A lot of people that I had worked closely with had been killed. In fact, I believe that by the time of the end of my tenure, there were no correspondents who had been there that long who were still alive. And they offered me London. I didn't take London. I had no interest in going to London or Jerusalem, which I did take under the precondition that I be allowed to take a sabbatical and study Arabic. I then ended up being 7 years in the Middle East. I was hired by the New York Times, covered the first Gulf War, based in Cairo, a lot of time in northern Iraq with the Kurds, covered the civil war in Yemen, covered the war in Algeria after the coup in 91, etc. And then volunteered to go to Sarajevo at the height of the war in the former Yugoslavia. As the executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, said, the line starts and ends with you. By the time I got there, 45 foreign correspondents have been killed. Dozens have been wounded. It was extremely dangerous. Shells, hundreds of shells a day on the city, constant sniper fire, roughly 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. So I volunteered for assignments that often nobody else at the New York Times wanted. And that was a conscious decision on my part in terms of how I wanted to wield the power of journalism, and in particular the power of the New York Times.
And the role of the United States in the Middle East, of course, has gone on for many, many decades. And the Iraq War was led to the largest migration since the Second World War. And it is there are some issues of what were the reasons that the Iraq War was started. I mean, we had the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and then the Tom Lantos and others saying that the Iraqis had pulled tubes out of incubators of babies. They had these hearings. It seems like the whole orchestration of the U.S. intervention in Iraq is really critical to understanding the present situation in the Middle East.
Right. I mean, so, I covered Saddam Hussein. That he clearly wanted the oil fields in Kuwait, and he wanted the oil fields in northern Saudi Arabia. He had large forces massed on the border of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi military, despite all their high-tech equipment, is largely useless. So it was a battle of oil. The United States had no intention of allowing Saddam Hussein to take those oil reserves. I remember telling my friend Susan Sontag after the war that the message the United States sent, this is the first Gulf War, is that we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we'll kill you. That's what it was about. But they had the foresight not to invade Iraq. Remember, this was, of course, extremely unwise decision, as we have seen. And it was a very callous, cynical maneuver at the end of the war. I was in Basra during the Shiite uprising. Indeed, I was eventually taken prisoner and held captive by the Iraqi Republican Guard. And the Shiites mounted a rebellion, including Shiite-dominated battalions that turned on Baghdad and were fighting on behalf of the Shiite rebels. I remember when we were in a very bad ambush. I was prisoner with the Iraqi light armor battalion. when the firing started, the soldiers around me were shouting to each other, Askady, and the question, Askady, Askady, Askady means army. Are we fighting army, or are we fighting kids who just picked up an AK-47? We ended up, fortunately for us, fighting kids who didn't know what they were doing, because in any ambush, you immediately take out the lead vehicle and the last vehicle, and you're bottled up. You can't move, and then you mow down everyone in the middle. Our vehicles weren't taken out, and although it was 16 hours of combat, they eventually formed in a kind of circle and then used their 50 calibers, their heavy weapons. It was quite vicious. But at that time, when it looked like Baghdad might fall, the United States or the coalition forces allowed Saddam Hussein to put the helicopters up in the air to defeat the insurgency, because they didn't want a Shiite-dominated Iraq. That second decision to occupy Iraq was extremely foolish. I would argue probably the greatest strategic blunder in American history. I think it's the death knell of empire. And of course, now we have a Shiite-dominated Iraq. But it was a utopian belief that, run by these loonies like Wolfowitz and Pearl and Cheney, who don't know anything about the Middle East, that we would take over Baghdad and implant democracy and the free market, and it would emanate outwards across the Middle East, including into Iran, and the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction, and these Baathists, Iraqis, would greet us as liberators, and it was utopian. And I use the word as Thomas More coined it. Utopian means no place. It doesn't exist. And that's what happened in the second Gulf War. So the first Gulf War was clearly a battle for control of natural resources. The empire intervened because they wanted to dominate the oil supplies. The second was this utopian belief that they were going to seize Iraq and then create proxy states throughout the Middle East, and it would all be paid for by the oil revenues that they would control in Iraq.
And the role of the United States and Israel is, I think, critical to this issue. You have the Committee to Liberate Iraq, headed by George Shultz, former Secretary of State in San Francisco. These ideologues who believe that the United States should help, quote unquote, liberate Iraq, what influence did they have, and what was the role of Israel in the U.S. Invasion of Iraq?
Israel was huge because the Israel lobby pushed very hard for the invasion of Iraq, because they wanted Iraq destroyed as a unified country, which is what's happened. It's fragmented roughly into three different factions: Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia. The Sunnis were always the minority. Saddam Hussein was Sunni. And essentially what has happened is the Sunnis, through Iran, because Baghdad almost fell, and this part of the history is not well known, but Iran sent huge numbers of militias and troops to essentially battle back ISIS and the Islamic State inside Syria and Iraq. They were the major boots on the ground that did that. And essentially now we have a Shiite-dominated Iraq that is allied with Iran. So all this talk about liberating the people of Iraq, I don't know, maybe they were really so ignorant and naive that they believed it, perhaps. But that's what's sold to the American public. This was an attempt to reestablish American imperial hegemony throughout the Middle East, and the control of the Iraqi oil fields. Those were really the two major issues that drove us into Iraq. And it's been a catastrophic failure. And we're now, of course, seeing, after the defeat in Afghanistan, withdrawal. So, I mean, every intervention that we made subsequently, whether it was in Syria or Libya, it's just been an utter fiasco. So yeah, it's not well reported. There aren't, any foreign correspondents left anymore, but it is been catastrophic and really turned the United States into a pariah, not just in the Middle East, but throughout most of the world. But yes, Israel was fundamental. I mean, they've always gotten us to do their bidding, their goals were achieved. They wanted intervention in Syria, they wanted intervention in Iraq, and they got it, and we paid the price.
And of course, we have the recent incident in Gaza where the Israelis bombed a building holding AP and Al Jazeera. But there was an incident in Iraq where the US troops bombed the journalists at a building in Iraq targeted. What
Yeah,
was
that's
that?
right. That's not a mistake. They know what they're doing. They don't want coverage. I mean, especially Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera was showing images from the war that never appeared on American networks. So that was a particular target. And Israel is so indiscriminate, and I've been in Israel when it's been attacked by jet aircraft and artillery. They talk about surgical strikes, which is a joke when you're talking about 500,000-pound iron fragmentation bombs dropped in refugee camps. It blows up whole streets. I've been there. I've seen the bodies, including the bodies of the children, and they don't want to report it. So even when I was covering, I covered both of the two Palestinian intifadas, the Israelis very cynically would just turn towards the journalists. They were firing rubber bullets, which are steel bullets just encased in rubber, into the legs, especially of photographers. I watched it, I saw it, and that was completely deliberate.
And yet these are recognized as war crimes, yet the American media never talk about the war crimes of Israel in what they're doing to the Palestinian people.
No, the American media is reporting. I mean, look, Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper with Jewish reporters, Israeli Jewish reporters, does a far better coverage of Palestine than I think any American media, mainstream, certainly media outlet at all. I mean, I lived in Israel. I lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, and there's a far broader discussion of the reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict within Israel than there is within the United States. And that is, of course, because of the power of the Israel lobby, which is a partisan lobby. It's tied to Likud or Netanyahu. And people forget that it was very hostile to Rabin, especially after Oslo. So I knew Rabin. I covered Oslo. And when Rabin ran for prime minister, they pumped a lot of money into Netanyahu's campaign. They picketed Rabin's house. When Rabin won and he was inaugurated, he didn't invite AIPAC or any of the major Israel lobby groups to the inauguration. There's a famous story that was told to me by a member of Rabin's inner circle that he was in the Shoreham Hotel in Washington on his first visit, and the head of AIPAC or one of these groups wanted to meet with him, and Rabin, who drank quite a bit and had a very foul mouth, said, "I don't want to meet with scumbags," or whatever the Hebrew equivalent of it was. So this is a very partisan, they don't represent Israel. They represent a very far right ideology. And that's what we just saw in the Israeli elections. It was a battle between three factions of the far right for power. Unfortunately, all of the Kahana and Kach racism that was considered, a kind of outlier when I was in Jerusalem has now moved to the center of the political space in Israel, and a very similar process has happened in the United States for a very similar reason. Israel, like the United States, is a militarized society. In the late 80s, they dismantled their quite generous, essentially socialist Historut network. And now they have one of the worst social inequality indexes in the world, along with the United States. And that has resulted in the deformities that now plague the American political system and plague the Israeli political system. And that's why Netanyahu was making all sorts of alliances with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Orban in Hungary and Trump. And Bennett's not any better. If anything, he's even worse than Netanyahu in terms of ideology. Actually comes out of the settler movement.
The Zionist project, the idea that you could have a state where there wouldn't be anti-Semitism if it was Jewish, you could have a Jewish state, that's been supported by not just the American politicians, the Democrats and Republicans, but also the trade union leadership who support the idea of a Zionist state. Where is the Zionist state going? Because as you say, it is further and further to the right as far as ideologically and fascist. And that history, of course, of Zionism working with the Nazis, inviting Adolf Eichmann to Palestine at that time. It seems there's a logic to this political agenda that they have.
Well, it's a settler colonial project. That's what Zionism is. That's a better way to describe it. So they essentially seize land that wasn't theirs. 750,000 Palestinians ethnically cleansed in 1948, another 300,000 in 1967. And it has all of the aspects of any settler colonial project, which is a campaign of ongoing ethnic cleansing, ever more virulent levels of racism and discrimination, and especially as the demographics don't play in favor of Israeli Jews. That's why they wanted so many Russians to come into the country. And by the way, they were willing to sell the United States out for those Russian Jews. That's the whole issue of Pollard, who gave intelligence to Israel. But what he gave to Israel was the entire clandestine operation, including agents in the Soviet Union. And essentially they shut it down, and many of those agents were executed. And then the Soviet Union would release Jews through Vienna. But part of the reason that all of the heads of the intelligence agencies in the United States did not want Pollard released, and this isn't widely known, although Cy Hirsch did a good piece on it, is that it wasn't just that he was giving information to a friendly country, it's that he destroyed the entire covert operation within the Soviet Union. And Israel was complicit in passing that information on to Soviet authorities. Yes, it's a settler colonial project. Settler colonial projects in the modern era have a terminal date. I mean, that's why, of course, I support BDS in the same way I supported sanctions and boycott against the South African regime. I would say in many ways, the Israeli regime is even more brutal than the South African apartheid state. As far as I know, the South African apartheid state never used attack warplanes to bomb townships. But all of the other, Desmond Tutu and others have kind of listed all of the similarities between the second-class citizenship imposed on Palestinians and how they have a direct parallel to the second-class citizenship that was imposed by the apartheid regime in South Africa on Blacks. That's, and I think that as Israel becomes more isolated, it becomes more desperate. So it seeks alliances with the Christian right, which, by the way, are kind of anti-Semites. I mean, they don't actually respect Judaism as a co-equal religion. These people, in their kind of bizarre eschatological view, will either convert at the end times or be eviscerated and slaughtered along with everyone else. So, but in that kind of bizarre eschatological vision, Jews have to take control of Israel before the battle with the Antichrist erupts. So they build with, as I mentioned before, these far-right regimes like Bolsonaro. And so Israel is kind of rotting from the inside, becoming more and more fanatic as it becomes more desperate. Its crimes are harder, even within the United States, to hide. It's losing support. I mean, before COVID, used to speak at a lot of universities and always tried to meet with students for justice in Palestine. And usually 40 or 50% of those students were Jewish. And that's why they've mounted such a harsh campaign against the BDS campaign, including getting 35 states to pass anti-BDS legislation, like it's illegal to boycott, Israeli products. But that's just a sign of desperation as they become more cornered, and the crimes of their apartheid regime and the settler colonial project become harder to hide.
And the role of Israel and even Turkey, Erdogan, in supporting ISIS, supporting Al Qaeda, what is that role?
Well, the main support of ISIS and Al Qaeda is Saudi Arabia. It's not Israel. That's really where you have to look. I mean, the Saudis funded it. 11 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. Now, of course, there's an alliance between the Israelis and the Saudis, but you really have to, I mean, the main promoter of throughout the Middle East, Wahhabism and Islamic extremism has its center in Saudi Arabia.
And the rise of fundamentalism in in the Middle East with the United States and Afghanistan, supporting bringing fundamentalists together to fight the Russians, the infidels. Now you have in the United States a growing fundamentalist movement, combining with a fascistic movement. What is that development? What does that development mean, and what is the relationship to that internationally with Bannon?
Well, this is, any student of history will tell you that when societies seize up and no longer function like ours, you create these proto-fascist movements. This is what happened in the 1930s. And when you have a bankrupt liberal center, which was also true in Weimar, remember that before the 29 crash in Weimar, the Nazis were polling in the single digits. After the 29 crash, the Social Democrats, the self-identified liberal center, catered to the big banks. They even ended unemployment insurance at a time of deep distress within Weimar. So, and that kind of by default, and then you have in 1932 the rise of von Papen and the old aristocratic class who hate the Nazis and believe that they can, recreate the ancien regime, this kind of conservative utopianism, but it doesn't work. And this is what Biden is. Biden is essentially our von Papen. The belief that if we bring back decorum and civility and gravitas, how much ever gravitas Biden has, which isn't much, that will somehow, we can recreate the neoliberal assault, but give it this patina of kind of imperial dignity. Well, it isn't going to work. And history has shown that. And so what we're seeing is essentially what happens when a society fails to respond, discards, in essence, tens of millions of its own citizens, casts them out, refuses to give them a political voice, refuses to address their increasingly distressed economic needs. And of course, now we're watching the unemployment benefits run out, lifting the moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions. I mean, you don't have to get a PhD from Berkeley in history to figure out where this is going to lead. It's going to lead where it always leads. And you can erase Trump from social media. Trump is the symptom. He's not the disease. Trump actually just hijacked the whole ideology of the Christian right. He didn't have any ideology. It all preceded Trump: the magical thinking, the white supremacy, the lust for violence, the hypermasculinity, the hatred of government. That all existed before Trump. It exists now. And if the Democrats, and I just see no sign that the Democrats are responding in any real way to the economic distress, then you are going to, get a competent Trump, a Tom Cotton, a Mike Pompeo. And when they attempt to carry out a coup d'etat, they'll have the organizational ability to do it. So that's what's happened.
And you were opposed to supporting Bernie Sanders. You said that his position on Palestine was unacceptable. And recently, Bernie Sanders allowed an $875 million military funding bill to go through to supply the Israelis, to rearm the Israelis. What's your view about the rise of social democracy? The DSA in the United States is the largest left organization, 100,000. Do you think that this social democracy will grow in the United States?
Not without a base, not without an organized base off the street. I was opposed to Bernie Sanders because he ran as a Democrat. That was also true in 2016, and I told that to him when we had a discussion. Because I did not believe, nor do I believe now, that the Democratic Party is reformable. It is a creature of corporate power. It would never allow Sanders to get the nomination. And if somehow Sanders had gotten the nomination, he would have ended up like McGovern, with the hierarchy of the Democratic Party united with the hierarchy of the Republican Party to destroy him. And Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and others made it very, very clear that if somehow Sanders got the nomination, they would vote for Trump. Trump was an embarrassment. They didn't like him. He was inept. He was impulsive, all of these things. But they were never going to allow Sanders, who's basically just a Robert F. Kennedy He's not even a New Deal Democrat because he doesn't challenge the military-industrial complex, which makes any kind of real socialism impossible unless you dismantle the military industrial complex that is just sucking the marrow out of the bones of the United States. So my opposition to Sanders was not so much on him as a person who I think has integrity. I think throughout his life he has stood with the working class. It's just that he is a creature of the Democratic Party. He won't defy it. He won't denounce it. And they will, he's essentially been emasculated. So that was and on the issue of Palestine, that's long been, I have not, I of course was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, have long worked with third parties. A lot of it does actually come out of my experience in Palestine. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. And when Obama in 2008 got up in front of AIPAC and read a speech that looked like it could have been written by AIPAC, I said, that's it. I don't care if I'm the only person in America who stands with the Palestinians. I'm not selling them out. There has to be a moral imperative for the values we care about. And this has been part of the problem with the left. Every election cycle, we get down on our knees and surrender every value we purport to care about and fight for. And that, of course, makes us not only a laughingstock, but impotent. We have no power. And that's why we just drift further and further and further towards neo-fascism. And that's a failure, a moral failing among the liberal elites and the left, which I just wasn't going to be part of.
Well, the rise of fascism is serious, and I agree with you that there's likelihood of another coup attempt, maybe successful coup attempt in the United States. Yet it seems that the working class here, the unions, are embedded in the Democratic Party, part and parcel of the Democratic Party. There is no mass working class party. The rise of fascism, how is it going to be challenged without a political development in the working class in the United States?
It isn't, but let's remember, we don't have any unions. Come on, 11% of the American workforce is unionized. I think 6% is that right? Is in the public sector. We don't have any unions. Our unions were destroyed, and then all sorts of bills like the Taft-Hartley Act makes it impossible for right to work laws. They can't. The capitalist class has quite effectively crushed unions quite consciously because that is collective organized power that frightens them. So you have a resurgence among some fast food workers, the nurses union, but in essence, the American working class, number one, doesn't have unions, and number two, with deindustrialization, doesn't have jobs, or they have temp jobs. They're in the gig economy, they're driving Uber cabs or something. But this is, without adequate compensation, without the right to organize. So we don't have any unions. I mean, we have to almost start from scratch. We certainly don't have the kind of militant unions that forced Roosevelt to pass the New Deal, the CEO, the Wobblies, and let's not write out the Communist Party. The Communist Party was a major force, partly because it was so well organized. With evictions in cities, they'd come to evict you, and next thing you know, they'd run down to the Communist Party headquarters in a city like Chicago or somewhere. Everybody say, let's get the Reds, and they'd stop them. That's kind of where we have to get back to, but we're very far from that.
Well, isn't that part of the problem within the unions? Because the AFL-CIO actually was a creature of capitalism, the witch hunts, sanitizing the unions to get leftist militants, communists out of the unions and bring in corporatist union officials who support labor management, collaboration, business unionism, and also were involved in U.S. intervention internationally with the AIFLD.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Irving Brown and actually organizing internationally to support right-wing corporatist unions around the world.
So they destroyed radical militant unions like the Wobblies, Joe Hill, driving Big Bill Haywood into exile, etc. And then they created essentially, corporate friendly unions, Cold War. That's how you had in the 60s, George Meany and Lane Kirkland and everybody getting up and backing Nixon's war in Indochina and denouncing the hippies in the streets. So essentially severing what was left of the union movement from that radical grassroots was a very effective strategy. If you go back and look at the strikes in West Virginia at the turn of the century, which culminated in Blair Mountain, the largest armed uprising by Americans against the government since the Civil War, their hero was Mother Jones. They had a kind of radical ideology And yeah, so yes, what's left of the union movement, and there isn't much left, has been for a long time completely co-opted.
And this hollowing out of America, deindustrialization, supported by the Democrats and Republicans, gave rise to a decline in living standards of the working class, and were one of the reasons for the rise of Trump and these right-wing forces. So this decline of US imperialism now, and its inability to challenge China to operate internationally, where do you see that going? Because it seems like Trump escalated that decline of US imperialism, and Biden is not able to really resurrect the hegemony of US imperialism internationally.
I wouldn't say that Trump escalated it. I would say it was already in free fall before Trump took office. I think it really began with, the invasions and disastrous interventions, largely, after Bush, run by Obama and Hillary Clinton. I mean, remember that they're the people who bequeathed us Libya and Syria. So
they were bringing democracy to the world.
Well, I don't even know if they believe that. So I wouldn't pin it on Trump. This is a long trajectory. Trump was kind of powerless to affect it. You just can't challenge the deep state, which is real and powerful. I mean, where is it headed? Well, it's headed where every late stage empire is headed, which is towards internal collapse. I studied classics, the late Roman Empire, the differences. Of course, Rome was a slave-based society, but there are many similarities between the collapse of the Roman Empire. Trump, is our kind of Nero or whatever, and he won't be the last. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia, which was triggered by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. It vomited up these figures like Radovan Karadzic and Slobodan Milosevic and Franjo Tudjman, and in the same way that Weimar vomited up the Nazis, these buffoonish figures that are dangerous. So there's a kind of comic opera quality to them within the inner circles of power, but the ramifications of what they do is deadly. So that's where we're headed. That's where we're going. And Joseph Tainer in The Collapse of Complex Societies, I think it was 24 Civilizations. He tried to pinpoint the kinds of forces that herald the end of a civilization. Well, we've ticked all of them off, including the overreach of empire, the extreme use of force. Never forget that empire is just the external expression of white supremacy, but it's the same disease, because we're, of course, attacking, demeaning, dehumanizing people of color, Latin America, the Middle East, Vietnam, wherever else the empire, wades into a conflict. And then to maintain the empire, you hollow the country out from the inside. Thucydides writes about this in the Peloponnesian War, when he says that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. That's what's happening.
And the financial crisis now in the United States, cryptocurrency, the massive speculation that's going on, the lack of confidence in U.S. currency. Do you think that that's going to lead to another financial collapse in the United States and internationally? And really, do you think Keynesian policies, which they're using now, are going to be successful in stabilizing U.S. capitalism and international capitalism?
It's not Keynesian because it's temporary. So these are temporary Keynesian policies. That's very different. They all run out, and most of them will run out by the end of the year. So they have responded to a crisis, but they've just delayed the inevitable financial crisis. Clearly, the boom and bust cycle has been riding a roller coaster since the beginning of this century. I think we've had 3 financial crashes, .com, 2008. So are we going to get another? Yes. How severe? I'm not an economist. You have to talk to Rick Wolff to get that answer. But yes, it's not stable. Of course, as Alfred McCoy and others have pointed out, what will kill the American empire is the day the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency. At that point, and we know from history, this happened to Britain in the 1950s, the economy contracts. Nobody wants to buy bonds anymore. The dollar's worth a third of its value. And so imports soar, it can't maintain the empire. You fall into a kind of economic free fall. And that is the final nail in the coffin to imperial power. I'm again, I'm not going to try and predict when that might happen, but there are clearly powerful forces that are moving in that direction, driven by China and Russia, that are attempting to extract themselves from the dollar, and that's really that's the end at that point.
By the end, I mean, what does that mean? Because basically, a world financial structure that is threatened with collapse is not just in the United States, but also in China as well, which has the largest number of billionaires
Yeah,
in the
but it
world.
depends how you respond. So, I mean, after 2008, China responded in a, it was completely the opposite of how we responded. They created a kind of New Deal system where they built new infrastructure, they kept people employed. It depends how you respond. I think that given the calcification of the United States, the way they'll respond is with a kind of very frightening police state. I mean, we're already the most watched, monitored, eavesdropped, photographed population in human history. And I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. So I think all the signs point to a kind of, corporate totalitarianism. That seems to be where we're headed. They've already destroyed our democratic system. It doesn't exist. It exists the way the Roman Senate existed under Augustus, but it's been completely emasculated. It's the lobbyists write the laws and the legislation. The corporate powers have taken over the judiciary. They've taken over the press, which has just become, almost farcical. I mean, CNN slogging Russiagate, or the New York Times is shredding itself, whether it's with its Caliphate podcast or Russiagate, or so. That seems, I hope I'm wrong, but that seems to be where we're moving, and moving very quickly.
And the role of the United States blaming China now and Russia for intervening in the United States. What has been the role, I mean, of Israel when?
Oh, right. I mean, this is ridiculous, because whatever Russia did, even what they list is what they did, what bots or Facebook posts. I mean, it's just stupid. I mean, the real left unsaid is the country that does intervene in a massive way in in our election process, and that's Israel. And there was a very fine documentary called The Lobby, where an undercover reporter from Al Jazeera went into the Israel lobby in the United States, and it's all photographed. And of course, Israel put pressure on Al Jazeera. It was never broadcast. Pirated copies are on the Electronic Intifada, which everyone should watch, because it's appalling. Bundling hundreds of thousands of dollars for congressional candidates, flying lawmakers on junkets, removing recalcitrant elected officials. Cynthia McKinney was a victim of this, that dare raise the issue of Palestine. I mean, you had Bibi Netanyahu, is constitutional violation, come speak before the US Congress to denounce President Barack Obama's Iran deal. I mean, it's so the whole, when we talk about there is interference, did the Russians try and interfere? Well, probably. I mean, I covered overseas. I was overseas for 2 decades. There wasn't a country I was in that the US wasn't meddling in the elections, often in a big way. Remember when we wanted Boris Yeltsin reelected, they gave him a $10 billion IMF loan, of which an estimated $1.5 billion went into his campaign to get reelected, because he was a servant of US corporate interests and big banks. And they weren't wrong, he was. I always find that kind of, remarkable that you can spin out this assault against China or Russia and ignore the monster in the room, which is Israel.
And the issue of alternative media, independent media in the United States, with social media, your program, other programs are out there. How do you see the development of a real alternative media network confronting the corporate media, the capitalist media, which have an agenda for more war and encouraging xenophobia and against the Chinese and racism?
Well, it's already had an effect, which is why they've gone after us with algorithms. I mean, it's not accidental that I'm on RT. On RT because I can't get on anywhere else, MSNBC or anywhere else. I mean, just the single fact that I'm a supporter of BDS turns me into a pariah along with my critiques of empire and corporate capitalism and everything else. So the media landscape is constricting, it's not expanding. And Facebook, Google, YouTube, they're all part of the now kind of security state. You had Twitter locking the New York Post out of its own account when it published the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop. You saw an active campaign on the part of Silicon Valley to elect Biden. They produced in the last weeks most of the anti-Trump ads. So now there's a kind of fusion with the politer wing of the corporate state, embodied in figures like Biden and the Clintons, with Silicon Valley. Of course, they removed Trump from social media. Now, I opposed the removal of Trump from social media, not because I don't find most of what he tweets or says revolting, but because I don't want to give that kind of power to unaccountable private interests. We know nothing about these people, how they work, how they reach their decisions. They're completely opaque. They know everything about us. And they're hardly going to stop with Trump. I myself know, it's not conjecture, that I have been hit with algorithms. I used to write for Truthdig before the publisher tried to fire Bob Scheer, and we all went on strike, and then we all got fired. But after, I think it was 2017, this anonymous website, Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, that the Washington Post put on the front page and attacked left-wing sites, Counterpunch, at the time, Truthdig, Black Agenda Report, with being essentially fronts for Russian propaganda, which is insane. Then they used algorithms to hit me, and IT people did a graph. So over a 12-month period, impressions. So if you went to Google, you typed in imperialism, and I'd written something about imperialism recently, it would come up with anything else. Well, that all got erased. So referrals from impressions dropped from over 700,000 to below 200,000, and I'm sure they're below that now. So alternative media also, through the internet arose, and it is now essentially being wiped out. So what you're seeing is these huge digital platforms funnel people back into the quote unquote neutral or objective media of the New York Times and CNN. And that's why the CNN and New York Times and Washington Post and everybody else is complicit, because it's redirecting that traffic to them and shutting voices like mine out. So we're not expanding, we're contracting.
And the attack on Julian Assange, his continued imprisonment, supported by Britain and the United States, they were very fearful of WikiLeaks and the continued effort to suppress him. Are you surprised by their vendetta against Julian Assange?
No, not at all. I mean, Julian shone a light into the inner workings of empire, exposed their crimes, their lies, their corruption. It was an unforgivable assault. So, whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, it doesn't make any difference. They're relentless. I mean, Julian is being held in Belmarsh prison for what? I mean, the longest you can be held in prison for a bail violation, which is what he's charged with, is 50 weeks. Well, he's long surpassed that. The whole, assault against Julian Assange is a kind of window into the destruction of the rule of law. He's an Australian citizen. He can't be charged, or he shouldn't be allowed to be charged under the American 1917 Espionage Act. WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication. We know that UC Global, which worked for the CIA and did security in the Ecuadorian embassy, taped or recorded all of his privileged conversations with his attorneys, which alone should invalidate the trial. He was a political refugee on Ecuadorian soil. Theresa May authorized police to invade the embassy. Lenin Moreno, again, bought off by the United States through IMF loans, revoked his Ecuadorian citizenship. The whole Swedish thing was fabricated. It's been an assault. What I think the whole persecution of Julian has been is a window into how the rule of law itself has collapsed. And that, I was in the courtroom in London when not in this latest iteration, but in the one before, and it was just farcical. And that's why, by the way, it was limited to very a very small number of people to get in. We had to line up at 5 in the morning. And same with Chelsea Manning. There were only 27 people, if I remember correctly, in the courtroom for her trial. Cornell West and I traveled down from Princeton. We'd leave here at 3 in the morning to get there. I think I mean, I know Julian and respect him and admire him very much. And of course, what's happening to him and to his family is tragic and horrifying, but it really is about the criminalization of journalism. It sets a legal precedent that anybody who possesses classified information, and I possessed classified information as a reporter for the New York Times and published it, can be charged the way Julian is being charged. And he faces 175 years, 170 years under 17 counts of the Espionage Act, and another 5 years for hacking into a government computer. So the empire, which knows how corrupt it is, and knows the crimes it commits, and knows its disregard for the rule of law, has to really make an example of Julian, because in essence, what happens is when people find out the truth, that the ruling elite, the corporate mandarins that run the country, lose credibility. And when they lose credibility, then the only forms of control they have left are propaganda, coercion, and violence. And that's what we're moving towards, because I think across the political spectrum, the ruling elites don't have any credibility. That's what gave rise to a figure like Trump.
And the rise of the growth of corruption in the United States, in every agency of a government, this takeover of capture of OSHA, capture of regulatory agencies. This has really become systemic and more obvious to people in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was catering to a very real rot within the United States that essentially marginalized the citizenry on behalf of this very tiny cabal of oligarchic elites. Jeff Bezos. I mean, when David Rockefeller died, he was worth about $3 billion. I mean, the money that people like Bezos or Elon Musk, 180 million plus. I mean, this is just unheard of, certainly within the United States. It is completely despotic.
180 billion.
Billion, yes.
The oligarchies.
Right, that's right. That's kind of like the Austin Powers movie. So yes, 180 billion. Yes, sorry.
I mean, the growth of the oligarchies in this country is massive, and it seems like the Democrats can't do anything about it. Just the.
No, the Democrats. What do you mean? The Democrats aid and abet it. That these are their donors. These are the people who prop them up. This is the power of Pelosi and Schumer, because they funnel that money to anointed candidates. No, they're just a politer creature of corporate power. The corporate coup d'etat is over. It's just, which version do you want?
And I think that this is obviously leading to a political vacuum in the United States, where people see the need for a political alternative. You've engaged in efforts for third parties. Where is it at right now from your point of view?
Well, third parties are a kind of expression of discontent, but they're not a force of power. Power is going to come off the streets. Power is going to come by sustained acts of mass civil disobedience. That's what I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. That's what happened. 500,000 day after day in Alexanderplatz, and the refusal on the part of the foot soldiers of the elite to use force to crush it. So, for instance, in Leipzig, the Honecker, the dictator of East Germany for 19 years, sends down an elite paratroop division to fire on the protesters. They refuse. The local Communist Party officials in Leipzig refused to deploy them in the streets. Honecker's out of power within a week. That's how it happens. It isn't going to happen by running third parties in their system. I mean, I think we should do it because it gives expression and it gives political form to those of us who are opposed to the system. But we aren't going to change the system by building third parties. I mean, I was very close to Ralph when the Democratic Party was using every trick in the book to erase him from voter rolls, including suing him, which they knew the rolls were legitimate, but they just jacked up his legal costs. The media was complicit in that they refused to allow him on the debate stage. I get it. Who'd want to debate Ralph Nader? Not me. but yeah, it was complicit in essentially marginalizing, even demonizing Ralph, because even liberals will still spit out this falsehood that he elected George W. Bush. No, George W. Bush was appointed president by judicial fiat, overturning all legal precedent by the Supreme Court. They only counted 2 counties in Florida. Even Gore, I think, now says that he won Florida. But the media just over and over repeated this mantra that it was Nader, Nader, Nader. And it works. It works because they have a monopoly on the platform, and most people don't investigate beyond the sound bites. So we aren't going to overturn this system with third parties. Now, I won't vote for the Democrats, and haven't since before 2000. But even Ralph understood. He said, we're not going to win. That's not the point. The point is to pull 5, 10, 15 million voters out of the Democratic Party to begin to create fear within the party. Politics is a game of fear. If they're frightened, they'll react. That's the only way. And you saw it with the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, they that's the only reason they reacted to George Floyd and the other extrajudicial murders by police. Wasn't because of the goodness of their heart. That's how it works. That's how power works. So yes, we should always have a political expression of opposition, but we should never be fooled into thinking that expression will ever change power. Power at this point is changed through sustained acts of mass civil disobedience, through physically disrupting the system. And short of that, we're not going to change anything.
And there's struggles now, many struggles of workers. There's the miners in Alabama, Volvo workers, UAW Volvo workers in Virginia, where the union tops have tried to shut them down, concession contracts. But the major mobilization of the working class in the United States was in the 30s and 40s, general strikes in San Francisco, Minneapolis. There haven't been general strikes. The last one was in 1946 in Oakland. Do you see this development taking place as this economic crisis threatens the survival of the working class? And
well, no, so the elites have done a very good job of breaking unions, in like Walmart. Isn't Walmart the second largest employer in the United States? Amazon warehouses, they've done a very efficient job of union busting.
Well, that's against corporate unions, though, isn't it? I mean, in other words, in the 30s, the way these General Motors, other companies were organized is mass worker action, thousands of workers surrounding factories, the entire working class coming out to shut down these companies.
Yeah, that's right. But the unions were actually illegal when those things took place, and it was Roosevelt who legalized them after the strikes. But I don't know. I mean, there has to be a good organizational network to pull that off. And the attempts by workers to unionize in major employers like Amazon and Walmart failed because of the very aggressive anti-union stances of those corporations. And that's so Jeff Bezos can have his mega yacht, which I think cost him $500 million, with, of course, the tow-behind boat with a helicopter pad, or his house in Washington with 25 bathrooms. I mean, this is just, reached a point of almost comic absurdity if it wasn't so costly and painful for workers themselves. These things, there can be spontaneous eruptions, but they won't go anywhere unless they're coordinated, united, and organized. And that was true very much in the 30s. So you would have had outlawed unions and huge purges. Like United Mine Workers Union would be a good example. And yet there was a kind of organizational bedrock that was there.
And that may be developing. I mean, you had the teachers' strikes, wildcat teacher strikes in Virginia and other places that developed. And it seems like there's a great anger, frustration, and class hatred growing in the United States about the conditions of the working class, their lives and their future, if they have a future under this system.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. And what will cause it to erupt, as a reporter, I know no one can predict. The famous story of Lenin in Switzerland 6 weeks before the Bolshevik Revolution, talking about how, well, those of us who are older will never see revolution in our time. And next thing you know, he's being funneled through Germany in a sealed train. So yeah, we can't predict that. You don't know. You know that Tinder is there, but you never know what ignites it. Yes, the tinder is there. I mean, what I think is always so surprising, this was true when I covered the Palestinians, is that you think people can't sustain anymore. And yet somehow they do. But at finally something banal breaks it. So in the first Intifada, a bunch of day workers are hit by an Israeli truck, several are killed, the place ignites. Even the Palestinian leadership was completely caught off guard, which again is often the case. But that has to be organized. It has to be, and especially if there are sporadic local uprisings, they're easily crushed if it's not coordinated. And I worry that the decimation of the left, which really goes back all the way to the Palmer raids, has been so effective, and the bankruptcy of the liberal class is so deep that we could, you have two alternatives at that moment, and that is either socialism or barbarism, to quote Rosa Luxemburg. Obviously, I prefer socialism. But the forces around us, I think, are certainly tilting towards barbarism.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Chris Hedges, journalist, activist, and has been fighting to get his stories out despite the corporate censorship and effort to shut down him and other journalists in the United States and around the world. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek.
Not at all. Thank you.